In 1881, Egyptian authorities raided the home of the Abd el-Rasul family in the village of Kurna on the west bank of the Nile. For several years before that, objects of clearly royal origin had been appearing on the antiquities market in Luxor: shabtis, papyri, amulets bearing the cartouches of pharaohs, and no one could explain where they were coming from. When investigators finally traced the source, they discovered that the Abd el-Rasul brothers had spent 10 years quietly selling off the contents of a hidden cache containing the mummies of more than 50 people, among them over 20 Egyptian pharaohs, including Ramesses II, Thutmose III, and Seti I. The cache was located in a rock shaft 13 meters deep in the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari. No European Egyptologist had known it existed. When Gaston Maspero, director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, opened the cache and took stock of what was inside, he encountered something he couldn't explain. The mummies hadn't been moved there by grave robbers or by accident. They had been carried there by priests, laid out in careful order, relabeled with inscriptions explaining each transfer, and deliberately sealed, around 1000 BC, during a period of deep political crisis in Egypt. Someone, in the middle of a collapsing state, had made the decision to gather all the dead kings into one place and hide them from the world. But among the royal mummies, there was one that shouldn't have been there. A pharaoh whose official burial in the Valley of the Kings had already been found, examined, and documented before the Deir el-Bahari discovery. 2 burials, 2 locations, 1 person, and the official tomb, empty. How exactly this person died, and what was done to make sure no one found out, that is the real story of this cache. The pharaoh found in 2 places was Ramesses III. His official tomb in the Valley of the Kings, known as KV-11, is one of the largest in the necropolis, over 180 meters long, richly decorated, its halls covered in religious texts and imagery. When it was first opened in the early 19th century, the tomb was empty. The sarcophagus was still there. Some of the burial goods had survived. The mummy was gone. At the time, no one found this suspicious. The tombs of the Valley of the Kings had been looted for thousands of years, and missing royal remains were nothing unusual. When a mummy bearing an inscription confirming the identity of Ramesses III was found in the Deir el-Bahari cache, it was treated as a straightforward explanation. The priests had moved him there for safekeeping, just like the others. A familiar story, repeated across many pharaohs of that period. Maspero recorded the find. The mummy was transported to the Cairo Museum, and that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. In 2012, an Egyptian-German research team led by Zahi Hawass and Albert Zink conducted CT scans and a full forensic examination of the mummy of Ramesses III. The results were published in the British Medical Journal and immediately changed everything that had been assumed about this pharaoh. His throat had been cut. A deep wound roughly 7 centimeters wide had severed the trachea and the major vessels of the neck. The cut was made with a sharp blade and was incompatible with survival. Ramesses III had been murdered, and someone had gone to considerable lengths to keep that quiet. The story of how Ramesses III was killed survives in 2 documents that have come down to us separately. The Turin Judicial Papyrus, a legal record dating to around 1150 BC, describes the trial of a group of conspirators who plotted to assassinate the pharaoh. The Harris Papyrus, a large administrative document listing the pharaoh's donations to Egyptian temples, contains a brief mention of the same conspiracy, already past tense. Together, they outline the shape of events, but they don't give us the full picture. According to the Turin Judicial Papyrus, the plot was organized to put a different claimant on the throne. One of the pharaoh's lesser wives, a woman named T, was at its center, along with her son Pentawere, who was to take power once Ramses was removed. The conspiracy was uncovered, the participants arrested and put on trial. The papyrus records that verdicts were delivered and sentences carried out. But the papyrus doesn't answer the most important question. Did Ramesses III survive the attack? The text is written in a way that names the pharaoh as the one who initiated the proceedings, but it never explicitly states that he was present at the trial or that he was alive when it concluded. Egyptian court records of this period systematically avoided any direct acknowledgement that a reigning pharaoh was dead or incapacitated, because even a brief vacuum of power could immediately invite new challengers. That gap in the documentation is not an oversight. It's a political instrument built into the structure of the records themselves. KV11. The tomb of Ramesses the Third was begun before he came to the throne and was originally intended for someone else. The evidence of an earlier design is visible in several places where later inscriptions were laid over earlier ones, and the corridor layout changes direction midway through without any clear architectural reason. On its own, this isn't unusual. Tombs in the Valley of the Kings were reassigned regularly. But there is one detail in KV11 that doesn't fit the standard picture. In one of the side chambers, there are signs of deliberate destruction. Not graffiti, not ordinary damage from age, but the systematic scraping away of faces and cartouches from several scenes. Tool marks left over a completed painted surface, made well after the tomb was finished. Egyptologist Eric Hornung, who specialized in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, noted in his study of KV11 that the nature of the damage doesn't match looting or the standard public act of erasing an enemy's image, the so-called damnatio memoriae, which in Egypt was typically carried out completely and openly. What happened in this chamber looks like something selective and deliberately quiet. Someone was removing specific images, not for an audience. The tomb that is officially considered one of the most thoroughly documented in the Valley of the Kings contains within it clear evidence that someone entered it after its completion and methodically destroyed chosen parts of its contents. What exactly those images showed before the intervention, that can no longer be determined, which is precisely what makes this evidence significant. The 2012 CT scan established that the wound on Ramesses the Third's throat was inflicted while he was alive, but it also revealed something else. The wound had been packed with linen cloth and a mixture of natron and resins, the standard materials of Egyptian embalming. This means the embalmers treated the wound when preparing the body, a routine conservation procedure applied to all injuries regardless of how or when they occurred. However, several pathologists who reviewed the findings in specialist publications pointed to something in the tissue surrounding the wound. The pattern of hemorrhaging indicates that the heart was still beating for some period after the blow was struck. The wound was fatal, but not instantly so. Exactly how long that window lasted cannot be determined from the physical evidence. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. But the window existed, and it is precisely in that gap that the question sits, the one that no surviving source answers directly. The Turin Judicial Papyrus records that the trial of the conspirators took place across multiple stages, with different judicial panels delivering verdicts in sequence. If Ramesses was wounded but remained conscious long enough, he could have personally set that process in motion. If he died before it concluded, someone finished it in his name, using the authority of the pharaoh as a tool after the man behind it was already gone. The papyrus gives no way to tell these two scenarios apart. That's not a gap in the record. It's a managed ambiguity, one that served the people overseeing the transfer of power. In 2016, DNA analysis of the mummy of Ramesses the Third produced a result that changed the interpretation of the entire Deir el-Bahari discovery. Lying next to Ramesses in the same cache was an unidentified mummy, a man around 30 years old whose face had been covered with a goatskin. In Egyptian burial tradition, this was the mark of someone who had died in disgrace or been executed by court order. The body preserved, but stripped of its identity and dignity. The DNA analysis showed a direct biological relationship. The unnamed man and Ramesses the Third were father and son. This was Pentawere. The man who organized his father's murder had been buried beside his victim, in the same cache, a few meters apart, for 3,000 years. That decision was made by the priests who moved the mummies around 1000 BC, roughly a century and a half after the events themselves. They knew exactly who they were handling. They did this deliberately. No inscription explaining the decision was left behind. One detail the papyrus records about Pentuer's fate: he was offered the option of taking his own life, which in the context of Egyptian justice was considered a less dishonorable form of execution than a public death. According to the document, he accepted. The man who organized the murder of his father died by his own hand, by permission of the court, a court that his father had either initiated personally or initiated while he was already dying. That detail disappears from most popular accounts of this story. In the Egyptian conception of royal power, the pharaoh's body was not a private body. It was an instrument of state, the living embodiment of the god Horus on earth, the guarantor of the cosmic order known as Maat, the point at which the divine and the physical met in a single human form. Any public acknowledgement that this body was wounded, dying, or dead before the succession had been formally established created not a political crisis, but a cosmological one. The state could collapse not because the ruler had died, but because the announcement of his death had broken the proper order of things. This is why Egyptian court documentation of this period has a built-in feature that looks, to modern eyes, like deliberate deception. The decrees of a dead pharaoh could be issued as his living will for weeks or months after his actual death. This wasn't dishonesty in any modern sense. It was a transition protocol embedded in the architecture of the documents themselves. The trial of the conspirators could have been started by a living Ramses and concluded after his death, and the paperwork around that shift would look identical in both cases. This is what the title means by a staged death, not a disappearance under cover of darkness, not an escape under a false name. A state mechanism by which the pharaoh continued to officially exist and act after he had stopped being alive, because the system was designed to work exactly that way. Ramesses the Third didn't stage his own death. The people who ran the state after he was gone staged it for him, and they did it entirely by the book. Ramesses the Third was the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, and his reign coincided with a series of catastrophes on a scale that had no precedent. The invasion of the so-called Sea Peoples had destroyed the Hittite Empire, leveled Ugarit, ravaged Cyprus, and rolled to the borders of Egypt. Ramses stopped them in 2 military campaigns, one on land, one at sea, which he documented in detail on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. It remains one of the most detailed military records to survive from the ancient world. But alongside the victories he was so eager to document, a different kind of crisis was building inside Egypt, one he was far less inclined to record. The workers of Deir el-Medina, the craftsmen who built the royal tombs, carried out the first organized labor strike in recorded history, around 1159 BC. The reason was simple. The state had stopped paying them their wages in grain. Papyri preserve their demands and the evasive responses of the administration. This was not a minor incident. It was a sign that the machinery of state had broken down at the level of its most basic obligations to its own workforce. This is what Ramesses III was hiding during his lifetime. Not a secret and not a mystery. The scale of the collapse. On the outside, monumental reliefs of triumphant armies. On the inside, a state that couldn't feed the men building tombs for its own kings. The conspiracy of Ti and Pentuer didn't come from nowhere. It grew from a system where external grandeur and internal failure were being held together by one man, and where maintaining the appearance that both could coexist at the same time was the pharaoh's most relentless daily task. The people who moved the royal mummies into the Deir el-Bahari cache around 1000 BC, the priests of Amun at Karnak, were by that point the effective rulers of southern Egypt. The high priest Herihor had taken on royal titles and was depicted in royal iconography. His successors governed Thebes as an independent theocratic state, while nominal pharaohs ruled in the north from Tanis. This was not a religious order in service to a state. This was the state. These men gathered the dead kings and hid them. They wrote identifying labels on each mummy, recording where it had come from and when it had been moved. This was a deliberate, documented operation carried out by people with full access to the royal necropolis and full knowledge of the history of every body they were handling. Among all the decisions made during this operation, one stands apart. Pentawere, a convicted murderer, a man who had died in official disgrace, was placed beside his victim. No label, no explanation, just placed there. When Maspero opened the cache in 1881 and worked through what he'd found, he reportedly stood in silence for a long moment before speaking. Then he said that this wasn't looters hiding kings. It was a state operation to preserve the past at the moment the present was falling apart. He was right, but the state doing the preserving was itself what had survived the collapse. The priests were not simply saving bodies. They were keeping an exact record of how each of these people had lived and died. And what they did with Pentawere, placing him next to his father without a single word of explanation, suggests that this knowledge was not an archive. It was a tool they intended to keep available. The mummy of Ramesses the Third is in the Cairo Museum. The wound on his throat has been documented, photographed, and published in a peer-reviewed journal. Pentawere, his son and his killer, lay beside him in the dark for 3,000 years, identified only in 2016 through DNA. The Turin judicial papyrus exists, is legible, and has been translated. Tomb KV-11 is open to visitors. The traces of deliberate image destruction on its walls are visible to the naked eye. The staged death the title refers to is not the story usually told about this pharaoh. It is not a story about a man who escaped into another life. It is a story about a state mechanism that kept producing a living pharaoh for some period of time after the man inside that mechanism had died from a cut to his throat. Papyri are drafted. Judges convene. Verdicts are handed down. Everything functions. The pharaoh is dead, but no one officially knows it yet, because the system was built so that moment would be invisible. A man who ruled Egypt for 31 years, stopped an invasion that erased every other civilization in the region, and was murdered by his own son, was buried twice, and neither time in the right place. His killer still lies next to him, and the state he led survived him by exactly long enough to sentence the people who killed him, and not one day longer.